And with that, Beth, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
So Jim and others have asked me to talk a little bit about where I see gaps in the field, and where our research can help to contribute to this discourse and this policy imperative going forward. I think some of the gaps that we've long identified in the field of atrocities prevention and response still exist. We still need to continue to focus on, for example, looking longitudinally, looking comparatively, building on the empirical work that has been done, taking advantage of some of the huge data sets that now exist on transitional justice, on peace building, on conflict, on all of the indicators that we know are predictive of mass atrocities. So that all still needs to be done. And I realize we're doing that now in a world of diminished resources, since this is no longer a policy priority of at least US government funding. But sadly, I think we're seeing some other European states sort of following suit in a way in terms of redirecting their foreign assistance and other forms of research investment elsewhere. So that's the new reality in which we're working in. But I think that work should continue. And I know there's folks on this call that are doing that, and they're taking advantage of now all of the data we have, and thinking really smartly about how to use some of the big data analytics that are now available to us to really mine that data and to identify some of those patterns that may not be immediately obvious to the naked eye. So I just did a recent little study of the human rights reports that the State Department annually releases. And it was fascinating to compare different countries from, several years back to this year's, and just see the massive shift in rhetoric, in focus, even just the number of times particular words are used, or even that have like disappeared from the discourse. So, we have all these incredible new tools now. And I know we're very worried about how they might be applied in certain surveillance contexts, et cetera. But at the same time, let's embrace them for our own work because they are incredibly powerful. Let's use them for good, and show that what they can reveal to us about the situation in the world. So, that's one area where I think we need to keep working, is this longitudinal, comparative, and empirical work. Second, I think we can continue to do those really rich, thick descriptions of case studies. When things have worked in the past, and trying to really tease out issues of causation and impact that have always sort of dogged us, right? We've had a hard time showing that our efforts have yielded results in terms of diminished violence or even the lack of violence. And so looking at key case studies and the trend lines that maybe had a pivot point once a particular set of interventions were deployed. And so to the extent that we can do that really rich, deep ethnographic research, and there's so many not only subject matter experts but regional experts on this call and as part of this community, I think that work really needs to continue. And then we're in this brave new experimental world where we had funding and attention by one of the most powerful states in the world that suddenly got turned off. And so, we could do this like really interesting, sounds callous, but before and after, like what has changed when the US government gets out of this work? Do we see a less imperialistic approach to some of this work? Does it become more grassroots? Does it empower actors that otherwise weren't empowered because they weren't competitive for big US government grants? So, now we're in this world where we can see what difference a state makes when it had made at least a rhetorical and to a certain extent policy and financial commitment to pushing a set of ideas. And now we can see what happens when that's gone. And then I think from more of an advocacy perspective, who's going to fill that vacuum? Where is that funding going to come from? Where are those ideas going to come from? Where is that heavy diplomatic lifting going to come from? And are the Europeans, for example, or will coalitions within the Global South really step up and say, okay, we all agree that we should be engaged in trying to prevent atrocities. Here's a different way of doing it. Here's a non-imperialist way. Here's a non-American way of doing it. And then what can we learn from what they come up with if, in fact, they do make some commitments in this regard? And then, the final issue that I would say, and this has always been true, but never more true now, we need to start thinking about turning the lenses that we've always focused abroad here at home. Dina Hurwitz years ago proposed and then did a study of thinking about atrocities prevention in the United States. And I think a lot of people sort of poo-pooed her and was like, what are you talking about? Like, why are you spending your time on this? And I think the current moment reveals the wisdom of her and the prescience of her approach. So I'll stop there. Really eager to hear what Jennifer and others have to say and then to be a part of this conversation this morning. So thanks.
Thank you, Beth. Jennifer?
Yes, good afternoon, and thanks for the invitation to be with you. Like Beth, I find these gatherings really energizing at the moment, and I think connections are incredibly important. So I've been thinking about your question about gaps, and I have some similar views to Beth around case studies, but I won't go into those given that she's touched so well on them. But I think for me, there are 5 areas I'd like us to both have more attention to as potential gaps, but also to make sure that we're gathering information about, like the research might be scattered, and I'd like to know what exists along these 5 dimensions. So let me start with, I think, from my perspective, and having been teaching on this a little bit as well, I feel as though the research work and empirical work on risk factors is really advanced, is really sophisticated. But what needs more attention and more granularity are what some would call sources of resilience. So the brakes against dynamics spiraling into atrocity crimes. I called them, when I was working as special advisor, inhibitors to atrocity crimes, and really beginning to segment out as researchers different categories of those. So I was looking again at the list of inhibitors that we identified a decade ago, and I have questions about a number of them, but they seem to fall more into the institutional line. So I'll give you an example. We highlighted media capacity to counteract prejudice and hate speech, the capacity to assess risk and mobilize early response in contexts where there's a risk of atrocity crimes, professional and accountable security sectors, independent human rights institutions, impartial institutions to oversee contentious political transitions, and a local capacity to solve conflicts. My list is really heavy on institutions. And I think it would be interesting for us to both, as researchers, categorize and drill down on inhibitors and sources of resilience. So that's the first one. The second one, and I'm inspired a bit by what the Holocaust Museum has done, and by some time I've spent with scenario planners. And there's a term in scenario planning that's sometimes used to describe why it's important to shake people out of their working assumptions. And the term is the official future. People have a definition of their official future that they think is going to unfold. And they're wedded to it, and their imagination is limited by it. And I think researchers need to, therefore, do a little bit of what the Holocaust Museum has done, but in an expanded way, and actually research and develop different plausible scenarios for the unfolding of atrocity crimes in different contexts. And as Beth has alluded to, in a number of contexts, not, dare I say, the usual suspects that show up on early warning lists, and really link those to what the policy options would be under these different plausible scenarios. So take a context. There might be 3 or 4 ways that you could imagine different types of atrocity crimes unfolding. So that's a second area I'd like to see researchers get into, and it involves some alternative analytical tools, perhaps from what we've been used to. The third area I think we need more research and understanding of is where and how external actors, or, and I use the word external in inverted commas because they can be inside a country context or outside, but where and how actors are getting their information about potential perpetrators in terms of their ideas, their means, their strategies. How are people seeking to prevent atrocity crimes getting their information? And I think case studies can help us with that in terms of looking at who knew what when and how, through what channels. Were there information sources, good information sources? And I think that's an area I'd like to see understood better. Fourth, I won't surprise you in saying this because I've been doing some work and I know the Holocaust Museum has as well, but really, if we are moving to a different global context with diminished resources, better understanding what supports civilians' own strategies on the ground, what kind of external support for those strategies actually makes a difference. I think we've begun to understand quite well what local actors are doing to reduce their vulnerability. We've really begun to understand that. But what I'm interested in is, how are those best supported? And do we have good research on that? And then finally, I'm not sure what this will yield, but I think it's worth doing. I increasingly find myself going back to chapter 8 of the UN Charter, which is the chapter that talks about regional collective security systems. And I'm reminded that actually the framers of the charter weren't convinced that the world was going to operate according to a global collective security system, because there's all kinds of constraints on a global system working well. And there was a working hypothesis that if you try to do it at a regional level, if you have developed regions and, in a sense, disaggregated collective security structures, they might function better. And so I wonder if we could do some cross-regional analysis of atrocity crime commission, atrocity crime prevention, look at regions in the aggregate and begin to compare them and think about their differences and similarities. As I say, I'm not sure what it would yield, but I'm working on an intuition that if we are moving into a world where regions matter more, then we might want some comparative analysis at that level. So those are just some initial thoughts to get us going.
Jennifer, thank you so much. Emily, you're up.
Great. Thanks so much, Jim. And I think Beth and Jennifer have set this, what I have prepared, up very, very well, because it really kind of ties those two things together. So the Alliance for Peacebuilding has been focused on, some of these more high-level, field-based kind of issues. And so looking at how, despite rhetoric, the atrocities remain a persistent global threat here. And we're not short on research and frameworks. We're not, we do have a huge amount of data to work with. And the US has passed landmark laws. We've got Elie Wiesel, we've got the WPS Act, we have the Global Fragility Act. But the issue here appears to be implementation that's been undercut by resource constraints, as Beth noted, and both financial and institutional. And so I think in looking at the gaps that are facing the atrocity prevention field, most acutely right now, we're really focused on this sudden and unprecedented change in both the financial and the capacity of the field. I think, there has never been enough dedicated appropriations for atrocity prevention. And now this is, an even more significant issue. And as Jennifer noted, this is going to be a huge hurdle as we try and train regionals who are now going to be the front runners on all atrocity prevention and trying to do any of the implementation of the Elie Wiesel Act. So getting those trained at the political level, at the regional personnel, and we don't have the thematic groups who are able to kind of guide them through that. I think, this is not just a US issue. We are in the face of global cuts to foreign assistance in favor of defense spending. So not only are we not having the funding that we need, we are up against a global shift towards increased securitization and militarization for these same issues. So not only are we unfunded, we're now a little bit on the back foot in terms of which arm of their government they want to use to pursue atrocity prevention issues. Outside of government funding, we are also facing shrinking multilateral support. The US and civil society have fewer reliable partners. We have fewer people who want to work with us. And on top of that, we have massive destroyed trust with our local partners. So even where we do have funding, those local partners are more concerned than ever about working with the US and working with the US long term. In terms of that institutional capacity, we all know that our experts at USAID and USIP are gone. We've eliminated the key State Department offices, CSO, DRL, the Global Criminal Justice, GWI, all of these important thematic institutions that could dovetail with atrocity prevention to focus on kind of a more holistic prevention approach. And so now with all of those gone, and we're facing this focus on all of those issues now having to be led by the regionals, we're simply at a capacity overload, and trying to get any of those issues, let alone all of those issues, trained up with that group it feels insurmountable in a lot of ways. And as we are trying to continue to train and push these issues forward, we're facing an uphill battle both domestically and internationally as challenges to the multilateral and international system as a whole are coming up, right? Questions of legitimacy facing both the UN and the ICC, the ICJ. These geopolitical power shifts are influencing these bodies and creating an inertia of inaction. And so the gap is that we're facing, that we're recognizing, is not just in funding and research, but where that research then will go, and who we can actually talk to, and who trusts each other in this system. The same time, those institutional cuts have resulted in a massive shift in diplomatic tools, reduction in field presence, and all of this limits the US abilities to react with soft power and the ability to act upstream. The whole concept of the prevention system has been put in threat because we don't have the capacity, let alone the funding, let alone the relationships now to work on that upstream prevention. So looking at cuts at other levels, our partners where we would take this conversation outside of the US government, the Brits and the Australians have committed to stepping up. They're trying to keep the IAPWG moving forward. But they're also facing cuts. They're also facing limited capacity. And the US government was the one that drove that process and helped mobilize coordinated action, even if it was limited. And now that that pressure, internal pressure, is waning. So there's a major issue with the ability to move things forward, let alone keeping things from going backward. We have this prevention-oriented canon of law, and we all recognize that it was never sufficient. None of these were perfect, but they were something. And now we are facing an issue of going backwards. We're facing an issue of trying to hold the frameworks. We're facing the issue of trying to get any kind of appropriations and maintain that funding once it's been appropriated. And so the framework that we're working with is now more limited than before. Outside of these resource constraints, there are, I think, several other pressures that are influencing the gaps that we're facing in atrocity prevention right now. I don't think I have to tell anyone that we are, the US and many other countries are more polarized than ever. And as atrocity prevention and peace building are increasingly polarized, they're cast as partisan, undermining our continuity, undermining these bipartisan efforts that had previously been quite successful, like the Global Fragility Act and the Elie Wiesel Act. I think, there's an issue of reputational backlash. Many individuals and organizations are unable to speak out against atrocities or violent attacks because it attracts public and even legal ramifications in a way that is much more acute than it has been, I think, in the past. There is a significant reduction then in the political will and the civil society and the public's ability to coordinate outcry with these issues. And I think it makes it even more difficult to get embassies and regionals to uptake atrocity prevention because they want to preserve their relationship with host governments and their own partners. So I think we're facing this kind of public space issue where we cannot mobilize the general public even in ways that we used to be able to, which we all know was insufficient. And then, this issue, and this is, a long-term issue, this is not new, but fragmentation and short-termism. Our donor and practitioner communities are now more siloed than ever, despite constant calls for de-siloing. As we face decreased funding, I think elbows are coming out a little bit. People are trying to defend what funding they still have out of a survival instinct. And so this emphasis on reactive, little emphasis on long-term structural drivers of violence ends up being a victim of this siloed and short-term approach that organizations have to take right now. And as I think Jennifer and Beth both noted, the focus to date has been really on the international lens, very much the US and to some extent the Europeans looking out. And I think that there needs to be some more recognition of our need to look in as well for those issues of polarization and dehumanization that we all recognize as concerns, and trying to couch those in atrocity prevention. And I think Beth, you noted Dina's work has not necessarily been an easy sell, and to this recognizing this, kind of figuring out how to address that gap, and whether there needs to be a different terminology or some other way of addressing what that kind of prevention lens would be in the US domestically. And I think one thing that the Alliance for Peacebuilding has been working on as an opportunity to move forward is and Beth, you noted this as well, and I think that this is one of those side effects of conflict, right? Is that it shakes up everything, right? And so we have opportunities to build things that are new. And while this is not a new idea, the Alliance for Peacebuilding has been working on building a coalition for peace economies. And not a new idea, but it is an opportunity for this idea to come forward in a way that it's never been able to survive before. So really looking at reframing atrocity prevention not just as law or as policy or as a moral imperative, but as an economic imperative. We want to work with private sector in all of its forms, whether that's venture capital or impact investment or chambers of commerce or the business communities, to share peace metrics and see what what peace would look like if they were to invest, and how they are benefiting right now from a stable society that USAID and so many other organizations have put much investment into, and they're going to face unstable spaces to do business very soon. So right now we're working to align peace building with business, finance, and multilateral development banks, trying to build a space for peace builders and the private sector, the business community, to start sharing a language and start sharing a culture, which to date has been kind of a difficult translation space. And we're trying to upskill both peace builders and our financial partners in what bridging silos in these fields look like. So to that end, Beth did shout out to this morning's meeting with on the Coalition for the Future of Peace and Security. The Alliance is working on kind of building what's next and envisioning a strategic plan moving forward. So I'll drop the link to that coalition's listserv in the chat so that anyone who is interested can join there. And that's trying to fill one of those gaps, which is right now that institutional loss, the loss of continuity, and bridging, building community, maintaining our community. So just to close out there, I think our atrocity prevention is at a crossroads. We have legal commitments on paper, but we have eroding capacity in practice that needs to be shorn up. And we must evolve. We need to build a relationship with peace building, economics, local ownership, and some standardized metrics. And there are a few concrete ways that people are starting to move forward, from the Peace Economies Project to the Coalition, to many of the things that I think we'll hear about today as the rest of the group shares their research. And I think that there is a lot of positive going on. This has been my remarks have been quite negative to point, but just recognizing that in gaps there are opportunities, and I think that those are starting to manifest, and I'm excited to see what will be happening next. Thanks, Jim.
Well, thanks everyone for this really great conversation so far. I'm Daniel Solomon. I'm a research associate with the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, and I'll be joined shortly by my colleague Beth Kenya. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of new research projects that tie into some of the themes that Ambassador Van Schaack and Jennifer and Emily were discussing during their presentations, focused first on our new research about support to civilian self-protection, and then some public opinion polling that we're supporting that Beth will talk about. So again, two projects. Just briefly to sort of give an overview of the Simon Scott Center's work, we are a part of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is an independent federal agency based in Washington, D.C. We support research, policy engagement, and outreach to the general public around the prevention of genocide and mass atrocities. And so these projects are consistent with those goals to help catalyze global action to prevent genocide and related crimes against humanity around the world. So just briefly to talk about our work on support to civilian self-protection, specifically in Sudan and Burma. We know a lot about how civilians behave in response to mass atrocities. I think Jennifer in her presentation alluded to the importance of drawing attention to the role that civilians themselves play in responding to imminent risks of mass atrocities. And so we sometimes in the sort of world of political science and sociology talk about a repertoire of civilian action. So in the same way that performers draw on a repertoire of different pieces and performances that they use depending on different audiences, civilians too have a variety of different strategies that they use to take action in response to imminent risks of violence. And so the research, and I'll post a couple of relevant links in the chat, including research that Jennifer herself and colleagues have conducted and supported, typically draws attention to 4 different types of civilian action. So one, civilians often work with authorities to try to find ways to protect themselves from imminent risks of violence. They engage in different survival strategies to ensure that they and members of their family and community are protected from violence. They engage in flight and other ways of evading different forms of violence during mass atrocity episodes. And then they take efforts to push back or resist against violence that targets their communities. But by contrast, I think we know a lot less about the growing patterns of international support to civilian self-protection. We have seen over the last few years, up until some recent disruptions that Ambassador von Schaack in particular discussed during her presentation, that support to the idea that civilians need adequate resources to protect themselves from mass atrocities is growing among especially international donors. So here we can illustrate this with 2 examples from the cases that our research will focus on. One is in the context of Sudan. I assume that many of you have heard about the important efforts of the emergency response rooms that have emerged out of the pro-democracy movement to provide support to civilian communities across Sudan who were affected by the ongoing atrocities there. And then likewise, in the context of Burma, across a number of different ethnic minority regions in the country, we've seen that civilians have long maintained these efforts to protect themselves from violence. And in both of these countries, we've also seen an important role for international donors in providing different types of support, whether that's financial support, technical assistance around access to specific types of technology, or other training efforts to help support civilians. And these cases extend well beyond Sudan and Burma. We've seen similar strategies embraced in Ukraine. There's a long history of international support to self-protection efforts in multiple different countries in Latin America. And so we are interested in digging into these cases in more detail. And the reason we want to dig into these cases in more detail is because there's a lot that we don't know about the kind of patterns of international support, and then also the obstacles that international support might face. And so in particular, we're interested in understanding in the same way that civilians have a repertoire of action to protect themselves from violence? What is the repertoire that international actors bring to the table? And then once international actors decide to support particular types of action, what are the obstacles that they face? And part of the reason why we're interested in understanding these patterns is both because we want to understand just descriptively what international actors have been doing other than these high-profile cases like the emergency response rooms in Sudan. But also it's important to understand the potential risks. So there might be security hazards that civilians face as a result of receiving support from international actors. There also might be effects on the ability of civilians to exercise their own agency. And so these are some of the themes that we're exploring in new case study research about support to civilian self-protection in these two cases in Sudan and Burma since the coups in both of those countries in 2021. So we're working with a couple of external researchers to interview both practitioners of civilian self-protection and then also the donor communities that were supporting those groups. And we expect to engage in this work over the next 6 months or so, and hopefully to share findings with this group and others over the course of the next few years. So now I'm going to turn to my colleague Beth, who's going to talk to us about the new work on public opinion as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel. So as you said, I'm Babette, and I'm really excited to share with you another project that we're going to be working on over the next year. I was so delighted to hear several of our panelists mention the importance of public opinion polling, because that's exactly what we're about to do. It feels fitting at a time like this to take stock in that way. So what we're about to do is, in partnership with Jonathan Chu, who is a scholar at the National University of Singapore, we are going to develop and field a public opinion survey to a representative sample of Americans in order to explore attitudes about mass atrocities and atrocity prevention. We are also developing a separate survey experiment to further investigate the specific elements and factors that can drive and shift attitudes on these topics. In addition, next year, we hope to partner with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs to insert several questions into their survey of foreign policy opinion leaders. With that partnership, we hope to explore not only, what elites think on these issues, but what their perception is of the public, because as we've seen in some scholarship, there tends to be a gap between what elites think the public thinks and what the public actually thinks. Before I get into what we're hoping to learn from these case studies, I wanted to spend a moment on what we already know. As, again, some of our panelists alluded to, many of us have at some point or another been confronted with the claim that Americans, quote, don't care about atrocity prevention. Or, if people say, okay, sure, Americans care, but it's only the liberals or it's only the youth. So there isn't, I think there is this misconception that it's just not an important issue. Luckily, the data that we have on these topics simply shows that these assumptions are incorrect. For years, multiple studies have shown that bipartisan majorities of the American public not only care about atrocity prevention, but consistently express support for direct U.S. action. For example, a Chicago Council survey from 2018 found that 77% supported using U.S. troops to stop a government from committing genocide, a finding that was supported by polling sponsored by my organization, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, in 2012. And in a 2018 survey by Pew, 41% of Americans said that protecting groups or nations threatened with genocide should be a top foreign policy priority. I think an important caveat here is that polling also reports a significant decrease in support for intervention when respondents are asked about specific cases. So more than 3/4 might have supported the use of US troops in theory, but when you ask them, would you use US troops to stop the genocide in Myanmar, only 42% would be in favor of that. So there is a gap there, and that I think is one of the aspects we're hoping to explore in our research. And finally, as I alluded to earlier, while there is this broad base of support, I do think policymakers tend to fall victim to the same misconceptions that Americans don't care. And in particular, a 2025 working paper by Josh Kurtzer and his colleagues find that elites, quote, systematically misperceive public opinion in foreign policy, misperceiving the public as more isolationist and inward-looking than it actually is. So that's something we both hope to explore and potentially hope to remedy with these new findings. Clearly, we have a lot of good data on this subject already. You know, why do we need more? Why do we want more beyond just a desire for knowledge? As you might have noticed in my little mini lit review, a lot of the key findings on this topic are nearly a decade old. I will caveat, as I know this is a very well-informed group, that obviously tons of relevant and important research continues, such as on support for foreign aid and humanitarian intervention, and also specific US policy actions in countries like Sudan or Gaza. However, in a brief and not systematic review of polling data from the last few years, I found pretty few questions assessing support for atrocity prevention more broadly, and that kind of work to interrogate American knowledge of and attitudes toward mass atrocities and mass atrocity prevention. Of course, I don't want to imply that just because these studies are old means they're no longer relevant, but it is pretty clear that both the world and the US political environment have changed substantially since much of this polling took place. If indeed the majority of the American public still supports atrocity prevention, we need to know that, and we can use that finding, as people discussed, to help us make the case to policymakers and to fellow citizens that this work still needs to continue. If the consensus has shifted, you know, if it's no longer a majority opinion or it's only held by certain groups, that's something we need to grapple with and interrogate and try to figure out what we can shift in our communication. So that's the key point there, I think, is that some of this data might be outdated. We've also identified a number of other limitations. To be mindful of time, I'm not going to run through them in detail, but I think some highlights I'd like to point out is that a lot of pre-existing data, if it asks about support for specific policy stances at all, focuses on military intervention or use of US troops. And as we all know, that is an option that is pretty off the table, you know, or a peacekeeping operation, that's just not likely to happen in the coming future. And the atrocity prevention toolbox is a lot broader than that. So we hope to get a sense of support for a number of relevant policies, and particularly those that are more likely to be seriously considered should the government choose to act. We also hope to present people with explicit trade-offs and competing priorities, so that hopefully their responses might actually mimic what they'd be thinking about in real time. And this would hopefully make it harder for skeptics to say, oh, it's easy to agree to atrocity prevention in principle, but these people don't actually mean that, and they'd much rather have our money and attention go elsewhere. Finally, I think it's important to get a sense not just of whether people oppose policies, but why. Because you might oppose a policy because you think it's a bad idea. You also might just think it's not effective. So can we look into that? And can we then change how we communicate so we can start to build the coalitions that our speakers were talking about earlier? Where this stands right now is that we're still in very early stages. We are developing our survey instrument and seeking feedback from some key stakeholders about what sorts of questions they'd like answered and what data points would be most useful to them in their work. Here are some of the topics we hope to explore, but we are really eager for input. So if you have any thoughts on the work, I really hope you'll reach out to myself or my colleagues at the Simon Scott Center. So that's all from me for now, but thank you very much for giving me and Daniel the opportunity to share some research that we are really, really excited about.
Thank you for the introduction, Jim. I will also note that I am currently a doctoral candidate in the School of Criminal Justice at MSU. I'm going to be giving an overview of my research related to social media internet use by white supremacists in the United States. I am not going to be giving an overview of all of the work that is happening in my department. We do a lot of work related to domestic extremism and terrorism and other kinds of ideological violence, specifically from a criminal perspective. However, the work that I'm doing is primarily work I'm doing in collaboration with Drs. Ryan Scrivens and Stephen Schaack. So this work is founded on a data collection project that we did in 2024. I believe I spoke about it at the last research exchange. And this was to develop a data set of posts from Telegram channels affiliated with white nationalist and neo-Nazi organizations in the United States, which is of interest because Telegram has long served as a haven for extremists of various types, most notably ISIS for a while, but now starting to see more use of Telegram by far-right extremists, including these kind of racially and ethnically motivated extremists that I typically study. So the current data set has information from almost 350 channels, 47 extremist organizations within the United States, and contains about 300,000 posts that cover a 7-year time period starting in 2018. So there are 2 different ongoing studies that are using this data. The first looked at recruitment by the Active Club Network, which is a very large network of white nationalist organizations with an accelerationist ideology, meaning they believe that in order to get society to kind of their ideal, it's necessary that there will be some kind of catastrophic societal collapse. And they are generally either working towards that or preparing for that. In the case of active club networks, they are typically involved in physical training to help their members become kind of warriors, preparing for what they see as societal violence in the United States. So I was interested in looking at how they talked to potential recruits about what it meant to be a part of these organizations, kind of what was the value proposition for joining an extremist organization in the United States. And I found that they talk about being involved offline in these groups as a shift away from this modern culture that they see as irreparably degenerate, introduction to a supportive community that's potentially more supportive than the community they have available to them otherwise, a journey of self-improvement, which is really where a lot of their language about becoming a warrior, a fighter for their people comes in, an opportunity to create change in their broader culture, and then also a difficult path. They anticipate that there's going to be pushback from the broader society. The other ongoing project looks at why extremist organizations are interacting on Telegram, because these organizations are not acting in isolation from one another. Modern extremist groups in the the extremist movement in the United States is very, very highly networked. And even people like mass shooters who often seem to be acting in isolation, they do typically have connections to this broader movement in some way. So we have preliminary findings from this study, which suggests first that interpersonal networks are shaped by similar processes, or interpersonal and organizational networks are shaped by similar processes, which is really useful because there is a lot of information on why interpersonal networks, for example, friendship networks form, but there's very little information on why organizations within an extremist context in the United States interact. So it's helpful to know that we can draw on this much larger body of research. In addition, we find that organizational boundaries play a key role in shaping online networks, which is notable because modern extremist organizations in the United States tend to be very decentralized, in large part in response to infiltration and sanctioning by law enforcement agencies. And this decentralized operational structure makes them more resilient. However, we do find that as they're becoming more decentralized, their organizational affiliations do still shape how they interact with one another. We also find that geographical proximity and offline collaboration play a role in shaping online networks, which is also notable again because the internet has really changed the nature of domestic extremism. It has allowed people to generally transcend their geographic boundaries to do things like create relationships with people in other countries. So it's interesting that these local contexts of these organizations is still playing a role in how they interact with one another. So before I finish up, I just want to talk about some questions that I anticipate will guide my future work and the work of those that I'm collaborating with. First, we're interested in exploring recruitment, how these organizations are thinking about growing their membership and their influence. So I'm interested in how these organizations collaborate with one another to recruit online and whether strategies such as deplatforming can effectively disrupt these recruitment networks, particularly when people are actively trying to reconstitute those networks. I'm also interested in looking at why extremist organizations interact online. Are they collaborating with one another? Are they infighting? Things like that. I'm also interested in whether violent and nonviolent extremists play different roles in their online communities, and then whether leaders of these more decentralized modern extremist organizations are still able to maintain effective leadership over the outlying parts of their organizations, particularly with things like cohesion in messaging. All right, so I know this is a very short talk. If you are interested in learning more, then please feel free to contact me. Also, if you're interested in other work that's being done in this area at MSU, we do have a terrorism, extremism, and cybercrime lab, and you can find information on other people who are doing this work. I think that it could be a very interesting opportunity to think about how the work that's being done and is currently being framed as work on domestic extremism, bias crimes, terrorism, things like that, could be thought about in the context of atrocity prevention, because as people like Beth mentioned, there hasn't been as much work as there potentially could be within a domestic context. And it's possible that in some ways we're thinking about it differently and using different language while doing things that are still relevant. All right, I'll pass it back to you, Jim.
Thank you so much, Sydney. Susanna Kelly from New Lines, you're up next.
So thank you for everyone who presented before me. My name is Susanna Kelly. I work at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, which is a DC-based think tank. We generally focus on US foreign policy and global geopolitics. And I work on the Mass Atrocities and International Law portfolio, which conducts archival research and legal-based analyses on mass atrocities and sort of leverages international human rights law to seek accountability and protection and justice through this. And you might have heard of some of our other genocide reports on this matter, on the Uyghurs, the Tigrayan people, the Rohingya, and some of our work on Ukraine and Russia. And so we always do try to remain involved in these thematic areas. So if you want to engage on any of that going further, also do please let me know. Today I'll be discussing our ongoing research regarding the Hazara and Afghanistan under Taliban rule. We just had a report launched 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I think Jim sent it out in the newsletter, so thank you. And we were actually fortunate enough to have Beth and Schaack write the foreword of this report, so thank you to you as well. This presentation will sort of go over our findings and follow what the panelists say, the challenges that really remain in creating change and helping the affected community amidst funding cuts and a lack of political will. This is especially sort of in response to the gender apartheid taking place in Afghanistan, the ongoing earthquakes and humanitarian aid misappropriation to the minority communities in the country. Okay, so just sort of on a high level, the report makes a legal assessment that the acts attacking and targeting the Hazara in Afghanistan constitute genocide. There's a reasonable basis to believe that the Taliban and the Islamic State who have predominantly claimed responsibility for the majority of these attacks meet the legal criteria for the crime of genocide under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. So the legal report only uses the scope after August of 2021 due to increased persecution of this minority group under the Taliban rule. But the report discusses sort of historic and ongoing attacks against the Hazara in the 19th and 20th century to clearly sort of establish this long-standing human rights violations against this community, and that due to the fact that a variety of different perpetrators over the last 2 centuries, Afghanistan has had various different regimes and people in charge. And so this makes it really a particularly challenging case of international legal jurisprudence. And this does, however, ultimately sort of pose a serious risk of genocide that also triggers the Article 1 of Geneva Convention, the duty to protect. And before I go like a little bit more into the attacks against them, just for background on those who may not know, the Hazara are an ethno-religious group that's native to Central Asia, and they constitute one of the largest ethnic groups in Afghanistan, around 20% of that population. There's smaller diaspora communities in Pakistan and Iran as well due to historic migration and ethnic cleansing. And they have been sort of distinguished from other ethnic groups in the area through their Asiatic features, their use of the Farsi language, and Shia faith in a predominantly Sunni Muslim country. And so through that, they fall within the ambit of Article 2 of the Geneva Convention, or the Genocide Conventions rather, as an ethnic group and a religious group. And so their religious and cultural identity has been linked to their historical persecution, making them really frequent targets of sectarian violence. And like I mentioned, it's been a long, ongoing list of attacks, particularly over the last 2 centuries. A majority of the report itself, if you look at it, is just, delineating attack, which I will not do for you all. Just it sort of establishes the legal bases. Around 60% of the Hazara were killed in the late 19th century, and that has today been characterized a modern day genocide. And since then, the cycles of violence have only continued. The Taliban and other groups have targeted the Hazara through mass killings, widespread sexual violence, taxes only levied against them, forced religious conversions, the whole spiel. And then since the Taliban have taken over in 2021, The violence against them has primarily been taken on by the Islamic State, the Taliban, and Taliban-backed militia groups. And so they've been specifically in Hazara-populated regions, schools, hospitals, places of worship, cultural centers, markets, transit hubs, weddings. The UN has documented a broad pattern of attacks. In 2022, there's over 50 children killed in attacks against them. And since the Taliban have regained power, there's been at least 61 individual attacks against Hazara populations and groups, and around 25,000 Hazara have been forcibly displaced from Afghanistan itself. And so the report itself makes the legal conclusion that this constitutes genocide, both the actus reus and the mens rea. And in our analysis, we're using the first three of the Genocide Convention: killing members of the group, causing bodily harm, and inflicting conditions calculated to bring about physical disruption. So they've been deliberately killed in various areas. Survivors have severe injuries, psychological trauma, and are living under constant threat. And the communities themselves have faced forced displacement, restrictions on religious practices, and that denial of food, healthcare, education, all this. There's also a strong basis to believe that the Taliban, as the de facto authorities of Afghanistan, have failed their duty to prevent genocide against Hazara under Article 1 of the convention. And this is again where it gets complicated, given that states are obligated to prevent and punish genocide when it happens. The Taliban are the de facto authority. They have also withdrawn from the Rome Statute. So there's a bunch of illegal things happening, but no real true international legal mechanism through which to punish them. And so here comes our super infeasible policy recommendations, and generally why I'm sort of sharing this report to all of you, because we've made some sort of progress going forward with like civil society outreach and diaspora communities, but it really, there's the real challenge that the Taliban are in power. The US shows little interest in working there. The main overseeing body in Afghanistan for aid, which is the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, they released their final report on aid malfeasance just last month, specifically highlighting how aid is withheld from minority communities, and they officially shut down last week. So, while we're pushing this attention, while we're pushing the issue to get the attention it deserves, there's real structural and political barriers in the way of making any sort of change. There's almost no political will out there. So while our policy recommendations say that we're meant to put up, set up UN mechanisms to document evidence, the special rapporteur is denied entry into the country. Bringing the case to international courts, there is a case in front of the ICC on gender apartheid, which is a good step. And holding the Taliban accountable is yet again another sort of infeasible policy recommendation. But ultimately, we're just trying to get this issue a lot of attention one way or another. There have been, we've had some work in the UK. We have a launch in Brussels next month, and in Australia. We've not really made a lot of progress getting this in front of US policymakers, but we're still working, with the diaspora members and civil society leaders. But yeah, I don't want to take up anyone's time, but would love for you all to, would love to hear everyone's feedback, thoughts, ideas. It's a really tough political climate to try to, especially given that there's, many different regions of mass atrocities going on. It's tough to get attention and even see solutions that are out there. So with that, I'll give back to you, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. Gwen, your turn.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you everyone for holding out to I believe I'm the last presentation for the day, so I will keep it short. And I don't
one more after you.
One more after me, sorry. Hold on just a little bit longer. But yeah, thank you everyone. It's great to see you all, and yeah, as Beth mentioned, to return to this space at very uncertain times. I wanted to update everyone very briefly on a symposium that the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict ran in collaboration with Just Security last fall and spring, called Thinking Beyond Risks, Tech and Atrocity Prevention. And the aim was to sort of do some thinking around the relationship between technology and the atrocity prevention field, but specifically to move beyond the sort of prevailing risk-only framing of technology in atrocity situations, while fully recognizing the dangers of things like, algorithmic amplification of hate speech, AI-driven targeting, but instead explore how both new and conventional or existing technologies can support prevention and accountability. The contributions, which aim to develop sort of concrete recommendations, covered a pretty wide range of themes, some focused on prevention. So Federica D'Alessandra, who I don't believe was able to make it today, and Ross Gildia examined how technology can be incorporated into early warning frameworks. Shannon Raj Singh considered how interventions on social media can counter hate speech and incitement in situations of risk. Other contributions looked at more towards accountability and response. So Miguel Moctezuma and Karina Garcia Reyes at the Latinx School at Oxford wrote about how drones can help locate mass graves in and beyond Mexico, which is the focus of their project. Keith Hyatt looked at how digital tech evidence can be usable in criminal accountability processes. And then lastly, Jackie Gase argued for kind of combining, open source data with local knowledge to improve prevention outcomes. And Britton Heller explored, AI's sort of dual role in both fueling and preventing atrocities. Forgetting the one contribution I'm forgetting is from Rhiannon Nielsen, who proposed using targeted ads to encourage compliance with international humanitarian law. So really interesting and a fabulous set of contributions. Since then, some of this work has moved forward. Britain published a longer paper on the dual role of AI in both fueling and preventing atrocities with the museum in April. But I think even when the symposium was published, there were, the limitations of the prospects were clear. And I think with the changing domestic and global landscape, those challenges are greater. So we're seeing kind of these shifts in US policy, a deprioritization of the regulation of technology companies, a boom in public-private sector cooperation around defense tech, and a loss of institutional capacity to advocate for, monitor, or enforce compliance with, both ethical, legal, human rights standards and how these technologies are deployed, are developed and deployed. And of course, US engagement with mechanisms like the ICC and the Human Rights Office have shifted, which I think raises, constraints for how they can leverage technology for accountability, since it limits both the resources and political space they need to adopt and expand tech-based tools. So so I think we mainly have questions rather than answers at this stage. So to me, the big questions that emerged out of this symposium unfolding alongside the developments of the past 8 months are, how do we at least protect, if not accelerate, the gains that have been made in leveraging technology for atrocity prevention? When US institutional and financial support is shrinking and the broader geopolitical landscape is shifting rapidly. Second, how can we influence the incentives of US-based tech companies to design and deploy AI and other technologies in ways that respect human rights, international law, and ethical standards? And lastly, I think, how do we sustain and strengthen civil society and academic actors who are driving thinking and innovation in this space in the face of growing resource constraints? It seems like that might be one bright spot, that there is so much funding that is moving towards this space. There might be some room for organizations or researchers to tap into that if they're interested in working on these issues. So, would love to know what others here are working on in this space. And if any of these questions resonate, please feel free to get in touch, to continue the conversation. So thanks so much, Jim. Over to you.
Thank you, Gwen. And our last presentation for today will be Madeline Velturo. Madeline?
Thanks, Jim. And yeah, my presentation is very different, so no worries. It's incredibly short. Just want to highlight in the or something that we're working on that is trying a little bit to address some of the questions and concerns that a lot of the scholars have brought up here from their research. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Madeline Valturo. I have a long affiliation with the study group. I started my career at Stimson booking the rooms and ordering the food for these meetings. Remember when we used to feed you? I'm not saying that that stopped because I left, but I'm just saying the timing is pretty uncanny. I'm really grateful to Jim and Julia for giving me a few moments to share an initiative that a group of former CSO colleagues and I are launching that may interest this community. So we are starting a YouTube channel where we share insights about violence prevention, accountable governance, and combating the abuse of power with a non-policy audience by reacting to popular film and television. So it's called Former Feds and Friends. And I'm just going to briefly touch on the origins of the idea, what we're building, and then like the opportunities for collaboration. I don't need to rehash what people have discussed here. We all know the value of the expertise that were housed in CSO, CPS, OTI, USIP. We know they're more important now than ever. And we know the danger of losing these institutions, but it strikes me, and from this conversation, I know it strikes, I'm not the only one, that we have also fallen short in making sure that the value and the benefits of this type of expertise is sufficiently accessible to the daily lives of most Americans, where they're going to feel some of these shocks first in social cohesion. So this challenge particularly struck me in the spring when I saw like USIP had made its courses free, available online in that brief window when it had reopened after being shuttered the first time. And I thought this was a really great idea, and it was incredibly admirable. And then also, even as someone devoted to this field, I knew I did not have the bandwidth to take those classes on in my downtime. And instead, on Saturday morning, like I did what I always do, which is I turned to YouTube. And around this time, season 2 of the Fringe, the widely acclaimed Star Wars spin-off show Andor was airing, and it depicted the run-up to and the fallout from a mass atrocity incident in the Star Wars universe. And in my expert opinion, it did so very well. I was pointing out to my fiance all the like little nuances that it was getting right, and it was like I was applying little terms of art, being like, "Oh, you know what that is? That's this." And he joked with me, "You should start a YouTube channel." So that's where the idea came from. But we've kind of built it's a team of us now that are working to bring this thing to life. And our mission is just to use popular film and media, as I mentioned, to inform and model constructive civic discourse that fosters stable and accountable governance. So we're trying to think creatively of how to make tools for identifying and disrupting cycles of violence more accessible to the everyday American. And in our flagship effort, we film former government experts in atrocity and violence prevention, democracy, rule of law, reacting to popular films and television shows. I wish this meeting were happening in a week or two when we had I have some published videos to point you towards. We will be launching on Tuesday. And our first episode is atrocity prevention's focus on Andor. We're going to post videos every week. On the docket for season 1, we have Superman, Black Panther, Wicked, Encanto, Zootopia, Dune, some Star Trek, and a WPS Miscongeniality special. We focus on fiction for 3 reasons. First, it helps to frame our content as entertainment rather than analysis or commentary, which we feel helps with accessibility. We're kind of using like a spinach in your smoothie metaphor, where folks come for the shows that they already know and love, and they leave with subtle but powerful lessons in civic resilience and tools for disrupting cycles of violence. And then we're also starting with fiction because it helps to bypass some of these hot button issues that could hamper a viewer's capacity to absorb the concepts. We really want to empower the audience to apply the concepts and tools we highlight to their own lived experience, which will ultimately lead to a better like absorption of those concepts and understanding. And then we just want to take advantage of this great resource that I feel like the space doesn't, we kind of often overlook, is like fiction has long been a valuable tool through which humans check our worst impulses. We peer into like our psychological blind spots, and we are able to comprehend and work towards more shared and communal goals. So we're a scrappy crew of former civil servants working to stand these things up. If folks are interested in collaborating, there are a few ways that could be particularly helpful given our year one priorities. Right now, the core group is just former State Department folks, but I would love to expand it to include former USAID, USIP, former VOA. So please send folks my way that you think might be interested in helping to be a part of kind of standing this thing up and determining its direction and approach. We're also looking for guest reactors. If you are a subject matter expert and you would like to serve as a one-time or possibly a recurring guest reactor, please read out. You do not need to be a former Fed necessarily. We are former Feds and friends, so the door is open there. If you have an idea for a show or film to react to, even better. But if not, we can work with you to try and identify a good fit in line with our early priorities. We need volunteers for it's not peer review, we're calling it peer preview. We want each episode viewed by 3 experts in the space before posting to safeguard accuracy, credibility, and reputation. So if you're willing to peer preview, please reach out to me. I'll leave my contact below. And then finally, we need folks to like and share our videos. Subscribe to the channel, spread the word. We're especially interested in partnering with folks who teach and engage with university students. They're one of our core audiences. So we've already worked with one adjunct from GW to develop the episode on Dune that he kind of crafted to be able to point his students towards to reinforce the lessons that he's teaching in his course. So yeah, like I said, I'll leave my contact information in the chat. Sorry for talking so fast. I know people want to get out of here, so I will just leave time for questions and I will pass the mic back to Jim. Thanks, Jim.
Madeline, thank you so much.